the 23rd, I'm going to give a synopsis of the course on Bible that I'm teaching at Gratz College this summer. And then the last one on June 30th, I don't have a title written down in my book, but we have time to get to that. So next week, there's a sub for this, but we'll get the content of the program now. So what I wanted to share with you this evening, and it should be a two-way street. I don't want to give a lecture. It has to do with what role did American Jews play in the writing of the Constitution. As you know, we had our cantata recently of George Washington, "To Bigotry, No Sanction." And the letter that Washington wrote was in response to his visit in Newport after becoming president. He had set out to visit all of the 13 original states, and they had sent him, that is the Hebrew congregation of Newport, which is known as the Toro Synagogue, had sent him greetings, and their president, who was a man by the name of Moses Seixas, had written to Washington and said to him, we're so happy we now live in this new country, the United States, because it gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. So what Washington was doing actually was echoing back the letter that it echoes back what Seixas had wrote to him. Seixas had a brother in New York, Gershom Seixas, who was the rabbi of Shereth Israel congregation. So when Washington went to Newport, the Constitution was already in effect, which should be obvious because he had been elected president under the terms of the new Constitution, which had replaced the Articles of Confederation in 1776 with independence. What you really had were 13 independent states that formed a confederation that was very weak, particularly with respect to the executive branch. And they realized between 1786 and the end of the 1780s that it was not a workable form of government. So they convened constitutional conventions, and ultimately, after all types of compromises and deals worked out, the Constitution of, let's say, 1790, you can use different dates for it, that had a three-part government with executive, legislature, and judicial. And no sooner than the Constitution was ratified, there were challenges from the Jeffersonian side that the rights of the people were not spelled out definitively. And Jefferson was interested in human rights, personal rights, the rights of citizens, even more than he was interested in federal government. And the Constitution itself was closer to the Hamiltonian Federalist model because it was compensatory. A non-federalist model had prevailed under the Articles of Confederation. So Washington's visit was part of that context of the country getting used to the new Constitution and a strong federal government, but had not yet included the Bill of Rights with its freedom of religion clause, although the federal Constitution has, under the executive, the statement that there will be no test oath of office under these United States. And that was a very problematic clause because it was widely assumed that where the federal constitution says under these United States, that referred to the federal level of government only and not to the states, so that whatever the states had with respect to the test oath of office, meaning if the oath of office was a Christian oath or had to be done on a Christian Bible, that Jews would be precluded from holding public office. And when Washington went to Newport, and he wrote the letter he did in response to Seixas, he made it abundantly clear that he favored civil enfranchisement for the Jews, and the Jews were still kind of shaky, even though the new federal constitution had been adopted. They realized that they did not necessarily qualify for public office at the level of the states. I'll give you an interesting example of that. Maryland had a restrictive state constitution, and it started as Catholic and then it became anti-Catholic. And its original constitution under the Articles outlawed both Catholics and Jews from holding public office. And to test that, Thomas Jefferson, when he became president of the United States, obviously a Jeffersonian who believed in separation, appointed one of the Eddings, originally of Philadelphia, as a federal marshal in Philadelphia to kind of agitate the situation, because under the federal constitution that was permissible, but under the state constitution it was not. So Jews were watching the development of the new constitutional system very, very carefully, both as it was being debated and then as it was being implemented. That being said, there were no Jews at the federal level of governance and governance positions, and there really was no Jewish statesman in the United States at the end of the 18th century. But it doesn't mean that Jews didn't play a hand in the debate about what would be the relationship between religion and government in the United States. The actual phrase separation of state is a 19th century term that Thomas Jefferson used in a letter he wrote to a Baptist church in Danbury, Connecticut around 1802, 1803. So Jews were paying attention to the development of a federal constitution, and they were participating as citizens, and in particular, Mikveh Israel congregation here in Philadelphia actually had a committee to study the situation, and that committee did publish its opinions in different newspapers, mostly in Philadelphia. About 100 Jews had fought in the revolution. 24 of them were officers. Washington was familiar with a number of his Jewish officers. Many were here from Philly, but they were as far, far south as Georgia. New England did not have very many Jews because Puritans, by and large, were quite hostile to Judaism, although they loved Hebrew and the Old Testament and all of that. So we don't really have a statesman that we can trace in great speeches until the 1800s, when there's a fellow down in North Carolina named Jacob Henry, who, when he was elected to office for the second time, was challenged on the grounds that the North Carolina Constitution required that an oath of office be taken on a Bible that included both the Old and New Testaments, and he therefore was disqualified from public office, and he gave a stirring speech that he should be judged by the content of his character and not for the way he prays. I remember as a kid, Cold War era, in shopping centers, they used to have these freedom shrines about the American Revolution and early national period. And there was always a copy of Jacob Henry's oration about the content of character. Um, Jews were active in the newspapers. They were writing letters and giving their opinions. Some Jews knew people in high places, but again, there was no one great single leader. Um, there is quite a debate today about Chaim Solomon, who probably is the best known character, but a lot of what we used to say about Chaim Solomon was inflated for all types of reasons toward the end of the 19th century, kind of to prove that Jews were important in the revolution. He really wasn't the best example of the time period, so he doesn't factor into the story as much as one would hope. The problem there was the United States was broke through the revolution. Debt was part of the Constitution. Chaim Solomon worked with Robert Morris to try to deal with problems of debt and actually did loan his money to the United States to help fight the Revolutionary War. It was a sizable amount for those days. But then later, his family sued for that government and asked for it back, and they inflated the terms. And I believe that ultimately they lost. Back around 1880, 1890, Chaim Solomon was put on a pedestal, literally by the Jews of the United States, as the great American Jewish patriot. He was a member of the Sons of Liberty when he was in New York, but he wasn't as significant as the legend, I guess, suggested he was. And today he tends to be downplayed compared to where he used to be. The real action when it came to Jews and the revolution really was inside of Mikveh Israel, and Chaim Solomon was a member of Mikveh Israel congregation. What has happened, and the reason that I'm involved in some programming right now at the Museum of the Revolution is they worked out a partnership with the Rosenbach Museum here in Philly, actually maybe just 2 blocks from where I live now. They have a copy of a very rare book from 1781. That book contains all the state constitutions of the United States in 1781. And a committee at Mikveh Israel got a hold of this book and studied it. And it looks like most of the work was done in January of 1783, because inside of this book are handwritten notes in the margins with dates. The author is not recorded. It probably was Gershom Satius. We have no real proof. I know the museum had a handwriting expert look at it, and they reviewed each state constitution to see what the status of Jews were vis-a-vis the holding of elected public office in those states. And the fact of the matter is, Jews had legal disabilities. The only state that fully enfranchised Jews without restriction was New York, although New York had restrictions on Catholics. Pennsylvania was quite restrictive in its original state constitution, what had happened there was a coalition of the Quaker oligarchs, let's call them, of first the colony and then the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, that had a vision for a kind of pan-Christian utopia in Penn's Woods, and they were in league with German pietist groups, the kind of folks who founded Muhlenberg College that were German, and they were of a certain streak that were clearly anti-Semitic. And between the two of them, they had come to a decision that Jews would not be holding public office in Pennsylvania, and that's how they set up the first state constitution. It's actually very hard to get to because Pennsylvania has made a concerted effort to bury the original state constitution, and it likes to talk about its second constitution of 1790. The only statesman who really stood up for Jewish rights in the first constitution of Pennsylvania was Benjamin Franklin. And then when a new constitution was written and ratified to align it with the federal constitution that took away the test oath of office, Franklin's point of view prevailed, and he was satisfied that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the federal Constitution were talking about the same thing, which he considered to be basic to the ideals of the American Revolution. The Jews in Europe were experiencing the same thing, except a lot more ink was spilled in Europe than here in the United States. There were vigorous debates first in France, then Germany and England and other places, where you had a long tradition of the Jews being legally quarantined, not being part of the body politic. And as countries and empires and kingdoms move closer to the model of the modern nation state, using the concept of citizenship and not just loyalty to the king, one of the questions became whether or not Jews were going to be citizens, whether they could serve in the army, whether they were going to pay taxes on an individual or on a collective communal basis. And it was an immense issue all across Europe. An echo of that debate, which ultimately became known as the Jewish question, existed here in the United States. But it's important for us to recognize that the vast majority of the original states still carried discriminatory clauses in their state constitutions that prevented Jews from being 100% equal. There were even state-established churches at the state level, and government money was used pretty freely to subsidize the favored churches. It's important to note that in this pandemic that we're going through, these payroll loans that became gifts from the federal government did include religious organizations. Maybe, Janice, you know the total number, but it's a lot of money that we got from the federal government. And, you know, from a technical point of view, it probably was a violation of church and state, because the most rigorous aspect of separation of church and state is to prohibit government money from going directly to religious institutions. There are favorable laws and tax benefits and things like that. But under President Trump, massive millions, maybe $1 billion or more total, went from federal coffers into religious institutions in the United States, essentially saving organized religion. I think organized religion would have tanked, and I don't think there was a single legal challenge to it across the whole country. A couple years back, um, there was a federal grant program to provide security to synagogues, and it was brought to our attention, and the question was asked, should we apply? Is it a violation of church and state? And nobody on our governing body had any questions. And I do think we realized about $25,000 for security, which 20 or 30 years earlier probably would have ended up in the courts, and the congregation probably would have split philosophically over that use of federal money. We had a speaker a couple years ago who actually declared separation of church and state to be dead, and that we now have the union of church and state, although we don't have a single established church. What Jews were interested in with respect to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, so that is to the end of the 18th century, was to make sure that there were no legalities which stood in the way of Jews holding elected public office. And the mechanism that had been used in this country for that was the oath of office, that there'd be requirements on the oath and that Jews could not be seated in office. By and large, I don't think the American Jewish community was hyper political about this. There were no national Jewish organizations. There was no American Jewish Committee. There was no Anti-Defamation League. There was no reform movement. There were just 5, then 6, then 7 independent synagogues that were not really capable of acting in concert with one another. I think that Jews probably, at least before the revolution and in their decision as to whether or not to support the revolution, were protective of their economic prerogatives as opposed to their political prerogatives. There was one Jew in the revolutionary period who ran for public office, and his name was Francis Salvador, a Sephardic Jew who had come from London in 1775, who was extremely wealthy. He bought a large plantation in South Carolina, was elected to the independent legislature of South Carolina after July 4th, 1776. And about a month later, while on a military mission with a local militia, was killed in a skirmish with British and Indian sympathizers. So Francis Salvador was both the first Jew elected to public office under the United States and the first Jew to die in war on behalf of the United States. So he's not much discussed today, never really had much, never made it to the limelight. And the story is further complicated by the fact that he owned a significant number of slaves. I just read a paper that a colleague is working on for a new encyclopedia that kind of details the shifting of Jewish tactics and Jewish identity from 1776 to the early 1800s, and how the concern shifted mostly from being protective of economic rights to aligning American Jews with the revolution. And the Jews, by and large, waited until the outcome of the revolution was fully known before they made the shift. And then the narrative came that Jews were obviously very, very patriotic. And it is true that the 25% or so who remained loyal to the crown among Jewish American colonists left the country and went either to Canada, which was the beginning of the Canadian Jewish community, or went back to England. And there were a number of cases where these Jewish Tories left and then tried to come back, but really were not able to very successfully integrate themselves into the new American milieu because of their stained background. So overwhelmingly, the community developed a narrative in the late 1780s and 1790s, and Chaim Solomon and all of those stories. The Jews were, heavily in favor of the revolution, and they were great patriots. They protected their economic rights, and they became involved specifically in this business of full civil enfranchisement for public office, at least at the federal level. The most important state case that tested the difference between federal and state regulation on this took place in Maryland in the 1820s, and it was an attempt to overthrow disabilities against both Catholics and Jews. It was sponsored by a Presbyterian legislator from Western Maryland by the name of Thomas Kennedy, and became known as the Jew Bill. That was the most celebrated case in which discrimination against Jews and Catholics kind of caught the national eye. And of the original colonies, only the disenfranchisement clause in the New Hampshire Constitution remained in effect across the 19th century, all the way to 1877, where Jews could not hold statewide office in New Hampshire until the original, that phrase from the original state constitution was revoked. So let me stop there and see what kind of questions or comments or additional information any of you may have at this point. It was a good.
I can add a few things, Rabbi. The PPP loans, they were paycheck protection loans that become grants. So
Right.
Is that how the government gets out of the separation of church and state?
Yeah.
That we don't have to pay any of it back. And it protected all of our employees. We were able to keep our teachers paid through the end of June. And then, then we had to close the preschool, of course. And the first year we got over $500,000. The second year we got over $300,000. I don't know the exact amounts, but you're right. It kept, and not everyone got it. You had to jump through a lot of hoops in order to get those loans. We were very lucky that we have the people that we have at KI to help us do that. And then the security grants, they were because of anti-Semitism. I mean, we're thankful for it, and you're right. I think it kept all of us afloat for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, for years, particularly the parochial school system of the Catholic Church has lobbied the government for direct revenue support for parochial schools, and the government always came up shy of that in terms of the Supreme Court, so that the Catholic schools could get help with textbooks, they could get help with busing, they could get release time for Catholic students at the end of the school day to go get religious instruction. But what they didn't want, and which they still don't get, is direct revenue support for tuition, or they don't get direct tax credit for payment to a Catholic parochial school. And this whole PP thing just blew all of that out of the water, and it's yet to see if any of that is going to change in the future. You have a certain dynamic in both Israel and the United States where conservative, small c, Orthodox, Catholic, align themselves in part with the more conservative political parties because they tend to favor direct government fiscal support of religious activity. It was the basis of Netanyahu's coalition, which lasted for 12 years. Now, assuming the government goes through this Sunday, they're not going to have religious parties in the government at all. And it'll be interesting to see what happened. And there was a trade-off in Israel because the money used to go to the kibbutzim, which were completely secular and part of the labor vision of Israel. And the kibbutzim were greatly hurt by the lack of funding. And instead, that money instead went to the yeshivot and to the settlements in the West Bank and to the yeshivot and the settlements in the West Bank. And Orthodoxy really flourished. There was, now there's been a great rebellion against that pattern by secular Israelis. Interestingly, particularly on the right-wing nationalist secular Israelis who have a real distaste for the Orthodox because they don't serve, the ultra-Orthodox don't serve in the army. The modern Orthodox, of course, do serve in the army. So, that situation has changed pretty dramatically there. Here in the United States, the Jewish community for 2 centuries now it's over, a very strong consensus about the separation of church and state. It was one of those safe issues that a rabbi could get up and give what appeared to be a really bold talk and say, we believe in the separation of church and state and no funding for religious institutions. But that has cracked. The wall of separation is cracked, and the majority of Republican Jews in the United States today believe in lowering the wall of separation between church and state, and particularly true among the Orthodox. And just like in Israel, they want either tax credits or direct federal dollars government dollars to go into the yeshivas and into the day schools. It's very expensive to run public schools, and it's just as expensive to run parochial schools. How do you come up with all of those millions and millions of dollars you need to make payroll and build buildings and maintain buildings? David Fischel's on the line here, and he recruited me in our school district in upstate New York. I chaired the bond drive or something like that. And it was worth over $20 million. Well, the Catholic schools couldn't have a bond drive that the voters, and some people in the Catholic community would always vote against it because their schools weren't getting any benefit, or senior citizens would vote against it because they weren't getting any direct benefit for their taxes on that kind of thing. So the situation has really changed from the early days of the Republic, where Jews generally sided, as the revolution progressed, as the reality of independence sunk in, Jews tended to be mostly on the Jeffersonian side, although there were anti-Semites too in the Jeffersonian camp. And what they were looking for, most of all, in terms of the writing of the American Constitution, was the separation of church and state so that Jews wouldn't be barred from holding public office. Good.
Rabbi, please help me understand something that I thought was the case, but maybe I'm wrong. And that is that I thought that the Quakers at some time in our history were very helpful to the Jews. Am I wrong, or was there a time when that was the case?
So as in any relationship, whether it's 2 people or 2 organizations or 2 faiths, it's always going through phases, okay? In the 30s and 40s of the 20th century, the Quakers were one of the few groups that were invested in the rescue of Jews from Europe. and they really went out of their way, whether it was artists or others, in rescue projects. So you could say Jews and Quakers were close at that time. And the result was the shifting of all types of artists and intellectuals to the United States because of the American Friends Service. There's just no question that is true. It's also true that in the especially post-war period, the Quakers, who are relatively small in number, opened up their schools to wealthier Jewish families, whereas other Christian denominations, let's say Episcopalians, who also had private parochial schools, were more resistant to allowing Jews to attend their private schools, their fancy schools, their elite schools. And Philadelphia is the most important example of that, where the Quaker schools dominate the map in terms of private education. You have public education, you have Catholic parochial education, and you have private education. And the private education, and this is before the rise of the charter schools. And the Quakers were the first group to let the Jews in. So we have an inordinate number of Jewish kids who have gone to Quaker schools here particularly in the Philadelphia area. On the other hand, after the '67 war, when the whole issue of rescue had long been settled, and Israel militarily took control of Gaza and the West Bank, there was a sharp turn in Quaker politics that became more or less pro-Arab. And relations between Jews and the Jewish community and the Quakers began to become strained, to say the least. We had an incident, I don't want to mention names, it's not fair to the family, in the synagogue where we had a Jewish family had gone to Israel, and one of their teenage daughters had bought an Israel Defense shirt, a camouflage military shirt, and she wore it to school. And it was an Israeli army shirt, and the teacher told her that it was a Quaker school and they were not allowed to wear any kind of military paraphernalia. The child on her own then said, but I'm sitting next to my best friend who was wearing a Che Guevara shirt, and it's camouflaged in green and black. And Che Guevara was a violent revolutionary and the soulmate of, to mix a metaphor, of Fidel Castro, and operated in a violent fashion in South America. And the teacher literally said, well, that's a different case. So the Jewish girl had to find a different shirt in the middle of the school day. This made the Inquirer. There were letters to the editors. There was an op-ed piece, and I believe the following year, there were no Jewish kids in the first grade class at Abington Friends. And then since then, it has smoothed itself out and gone back to what was the prior normal in the relationship with the Quaker community. I would say historically, to answer the question more grandly, when William Penn created Pennsylvania, he did so as a Quaker, and I think there was a tacit assumption of at least Quaker hegemony in Pennsylvania, but it would be an umbrella state for all Christian groups. Penn did not think about Jews. He didn't think about inviting them, and he didn't think about disinviting them. But right around 1700, traveling Jewish businessmen from New York began to make their way particularly into the into Philadelphia and a little kind of between Philadelphia and Wilmington in an area that was known as New Sweden, and were important in developing the economy there. The part of Penn was a utopianist, and he wanted to have Pennsylvania as a holy experiment and a religious utopia for all different types of Christians. He also was progressive with respect to Native Americans and really didn't give much thought to Jews. So he didn't ban Jews, but in the wake of how he set things up, other elements, including from the Quaker community, did seek to disenfranchise Jews politically.
Okay, thanks. Now I'm going to watch you on the big screen again.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Rabbi, you mentioned before we were talking about the loans from the federal government. At the time, almost immediately, there was an editorial in the New York Times, a fairly liberal publication, that chastised it and immediately called it out as a breaking down of that wall between church and state. Other than that one editorial, I don't recall hearing much disagreement with the loans.
Right. And that's the whole point. A lone voice, even from the New York Times, was not enough to derail challenge. It had no traction whatsoever across the country. I don't even think the reform movement put anything out. When the security offer came out 4 or 5 years ago, we did get notice from the Union of Reform Judaism not to take, and I conveyed that to the board. I think Peter Soloff was president then, and he kind of just laughed. And there was no one in the board who stood up and said, well, listen, there's a principle here that we have to uphold. That the keystone to Jewish security in America is full enfranchisement, because if you can eliminate Jews from public office because they can't take an oath of office, then you can have the slippery slope and a cascading effect where other disabilities will begin to appear to limit Jewish rights in America. So there was an attempt to block on the security grants, but on this one, which was of a much higher magnitude, it was pretty quiet in the room, with the exception of the Times. The Times can be, look, I'm a fan of the New York Times, and my sister has had a very successful 30-year career as a writer for the New York Times. She writes on international real estate as part of their real estate section, and frequently has the front page story on real estate and on the Sunday edition of the New York Times. The Times can be pretty funny on Jewish issues. There's no question about that. They favor this guy, Peter Meinart, who's an intellectual and is quirky and has no traction in the real world, but they keep giving him a platform. My friend Paul Finkelman and I submitted an op-ed piece celebrating the 100th anniversary of Louis Brandeis's nomination to the Supreme Court, 1916 to 2016, and ultimately were rejected. The editors were not satisfied because we were unwilling to make the claim that when Jews broke the Supreme Court glass ceiling, that was the end of anti-Semitism in America, which is patently absurd, because the most anti-Semitic laws in this country's history were passed between 1921 and 1924, barring immigration, and much of it was not exclusively, but much of it was aimed against Jews. So we couldn't agree with them, and they said our thesis was not bold enough, and therefore rejected the article. We ran it instead in the Huffington Post and in the blogs of the Reform movement. Reform Judaism magazine had already been disbanded. So I'm glad you pointed that out. But the fact of the matter is the Times could not even motivate the ACLU to take this up. You would have thought there would have been a legal challenge to it, but there wasn't, because everything was at stake at this point, and organized religion, which of course is an oxymoron for those of us in the business, because we know it's not that organized and it's not always that religious, was going to collapse. It was just going to completely collapse without this support. So there it went. Now, at a personal level, I have given the invocation both in the New York State legislature and the House in New York, and I gave the invocation in the year, I think it was 2000, either 1999 or 2000, in the United States House of Representatives. I was called by our then congressman from Binghamton, New York. It was Tom Libis, and said, he was aware of my public activity in the community, and he wanted me to be the, chaplain of the moment in the House of Representatives, and to give the prayer. And, I said to him, I'm completely honored by this, but I really need to think about it, because it is a significant violation of church and state. And I'm a Reformed Jew, and Reformed Judaism believes in the separation of church and state. And the congressman said to me, well, I understand that and I respect that. So why don't you think about it and get back to me? And in the next breath, I said to him, okay, I thought about it. I'll do it. He said, well, how'd you change your mind so quickly? And I said, well, how am I going to call my mother and tell her I was just invited to give the opening prayer for the United States House of Representatives, and I turned it down for some cockamamie abstract belief in the separation of church and state? So I'm going to do it. And we had a bus, David, if you remember, and we went down and stayed overnight, and we went to, I don't know, a Burmese restaurant or something like that. And I got up on the dais and I gave the prayer. I will also tell you that it was, I don't want to use the word censored, but it was very strictly, there were very strict rules, and it was read by the chaplain of the House, and it was approved before I gave it. And the reason for that is, way back when John Kennedy was sworn in as president of the United States, he invited Rabbi Nelson Glick, who was the president of the Hebrew Union College, to give one of the invocations for the president being sworn in. And Glick's invocation lasted more than 20 minutes. And after that, they had rules and regulations about the prayer. I would hasten to add, in the colonial period, or the New Nation period with George Washington, that George Washington invited 41 clergymen to witness his swearing into office. And one of them was the so-called Rabbi of New York, the Gershom Satius, whose brother again wrote the famous letter to Washington in Newport. So, we have a funny relationship to this concept of separation in church and state. It was the first order of business among American Jews to make sure that we are fully enfranchised citizens in this country, but it's also something we're willing to play with on the margins, depending on exactly what it does to us, how it helps us, or how it hurts us. Linda, do you have a hand up, or you have to unmute? Unmute yourself. Linda knows a great deal about all of this, so let's hear what she has to say.
Well, in the beginning, in the early colonial period, Jews were being, well, first of all, there was a rule that stores had to be closed on Sunday, that this is the Sabbath, and Jews were saying, well, this is a punishment against us, because we'll have to have our shops closed Saturday and Sunday, and we're going to be fined for keeping it open by working on a Saturday. And it was got to be a real problem, and they had to fight that one out too as well.
That's right. They're called blue laws.
That's right.
And the most important case on blue laws came up in South Carolina in the 1840s. A Jewish man was sued for running a business, selling gloves actually, on Sunday. And he took it to court, and there was a Judge Rice in Charleston who ruled and said to the Jewish plaintiff that you're going to have to keep 2 Sabbaths. If you want to take off Saturday, that's your business, but you're not going to take off on Sunday. So we all know, if you turn the clock back 50 years, if I think back to my childhood, there was still a distinctive quality about Sunday. The blue laws were still very much in effect, but over time they have eroded tremendously. And Sunday, in many instances, is just another business day. I mean, corporations aren't necessarily filling their offices on Sunday, but a lot of car dealerships, which surprises me, are closed on Sunday. I guess it's the day to go and look in the parking lot at the cars without a salesman going up to you. But it would seem to me they would want to be open Saturday and Sunday and closed on Monday, but they have not made that shift. But you're absolutely right. Blue laws were another area in which Jews needed to fight. And that to me falls under economic rights, which was I think what the majority of Jews were worrying about. Would they be denied any economic rights? And the most infamous case there was in 1775. Aaron Lopez of Newport, Rhode Island, who, if not the richest man in Rhode Island, he was a Sephardic Jew of Portuguese descent, had applied for naturalization in the state of Rhode Island. And it's pretty clear that his business competitors blocked it because they didn't want him to have yet additional advantages. And he had to go across the state line, and he became a citizen of Massachusetts because his enemies and competitors in Rhode Island, which ironically had started as a safe haven for religious dissidents, denied the wealthiest Jew in that community full citizenship. Strictly on economic grounds. Good. Any other comments or questions about it? You start getting Jews in Congress and the Senate, mostly around the 1840s. The most well-known Jewish politician of the 19th century was Judah P. Benjamin, who was the senator from Louisiana. He was a slave owner. He had a big plantation with 300 slaves south of New Orleans. He went on to be the Attorney General and then the Secretary of State of the Confederacy. The biggest resistance to Jews serving in high places came from the Boston Brahmins in New England. They were very much against Brandeis and others. That's really what the Wilson Brandeis nomination was aiming at cracking, was the prohibitions brought about by the Boston Brahmins. And it has led historians to debate the nature of anti-Semitism in America as to whether or not it flows mostly from the top of society down or from the bottom of society up. And there are historians on both sides looking at it from a different direction. For years, I've been of the opinion that the most dangerous populist anti-Semitism in the United States has come from the far right. And I think that remains true to the day. It's highly weaponized. But with this last go round in Gaza, it's very clear we have an increased not only Muslim population, but Arab and Palestinian population in the United States. And they too now seem to be weaponized and following specifically the Hamas line, are attacking Jews openly, assuming every Jew is a supporter of Israel. So we are getting it from elements both on the left, the right, and different ethnic groups at this point in the United States. I'm hoping that in the long run we'll be okay, and Jews will not become a persecuted minority. I think most Jews are still feeling pretty safe in the United States, that we really were the first true beneficiaries of the American Revolution, this idea of inclusion of people who were different, and that we could acculturate and yet remain distinct from the rest of the population. So we're at the hour mark, and I just wanted to make sure that anybody who had a comment or question had the opportunity to do so before we take leave of one another. So a reminder that next week I have a sub, and thank you for allowing me to rehearse this program that I'll be giving to the patrons of the Museum of the American Revolution. And Janice, would you like to close us with, and you always keep such good notes on things going on at KI, so.
It's wonderful. If you want to know what's going on at KI, tune into our annual meeting on Thursday, the 17th, when Rabbi and I will give a report. The treasurer will be giving a report, kind of like our State of the Union at the end of the year. I was counting up how many programs, like if everybody came to Zone Eggs, there were like 45 Zone Eggs this year. And coming to Rabbi Talk every Wednesday night. I went to hundreds of events at KI without even going to KI this year. Our last Zone Egg is this Friday night, and we're going to talk about all the people that were interviewed. So it should be very interesting. You and Cantor Amy are both there Friday night, correct?
We decided we would end it together, although really this was my area Wednesday night and she did Friday, but to end, we're going to do it together. Yeah.
Okay, so Shabbat Lalev at 6 o'clock, and then our last.
It's not Lalev, it's regular. That was a misprint. Okay, it's a regular, beautiful Shabbat, which will be heartfelt.
Okay. And my announcements, I do the announcements on Wednesday, so I'm saying Shabbat Lalev. Right. But it'll be beautiful. So just watch us. Good. And I'll see everybody for real next Friday night.
Okay, all. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope the rest of your evening is very pleasant. Stay safe. Keep wearing masks in crowded places.
We'll be wearing masks and then we'll relook at it at the end of June and decide whether we can come inside or be in the tent without masks.
Good.
We've had lots of discussions.
Make sure you're vaccinated and all of that. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Good, everybody. Thank you.
Rabbi,
Thank you. Thanks, Rabbi.
Just a passing comment on something you said the other day about your Baltimore congregation being wary of German Jews during World War II. You don't have to go that far. There's an interesting story about a KI member who, make a long story short, because of concerns for family he still had in Germany, was accused of being a spy for Germany.
Well, I need to learn more about that from you. Maybe that's worth a little investigative reporting.
Oh, it was in the New York Times too, and at the time, small article.
Okay, I want to hear about it. Generally, I thought KI had a better reputation than Oab Shalom, but we'll see what the exceptions were. So, good. Thanks, Jack.
Sure.
Thank you.
Jack is our archivist, everybody. If you don't know him, he digs deep into KI history and knows a tremendous amount. So, Lila Tov.
Lila Tov.
Bonsoir, adieu, or any other way of saying goodbye with affection. Okay.
Good night.
Good night, all.